Good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. The International Association for Human Rights and Social Development, or AIDHDES, with the support of the Committee of International Solidarity and Struggle for Peace in Venezuela, COSI, and the Bakia Foundation in Bogota, Colombia, we would all like to welcome you to this parallel event to the 50th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council entitled Donbass, War and Its Consequences. We are grateful for the presence of the diplomatic delegations that follow us, as well as the media, associations, and organizations that today fight for a just and equitable world of peace. The aim of this event is to give us an objective, clear, concrete, and perhaps alternative vision of what is currently happening between Ukraine and Russia. We want to be told how the current conflict between these two countries affects us and what repercussions the world will experience during this event and afterwards, which undoubtedly marks a new stage in the history of our world. We call for peace, hoping that this conflict will end soon and that a solution will be found that will benefit both Ukrainians and Russians. War destroys the human spirit, and the human spirit has been lacking in the world for a long time. To begin our event, I will first of all give the floor to the Honorable Special Rapporteur on the negative effects of unilateral coercive measures, who will give us, within the framework of her mandate, a general context of the measures that have been taken today in this conflict. We will listen to her position objectively and concretely. Rapporteur, good afternoon from Geneva. How are you?
Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I apologize, no interpretation to English is functioning. That's why I can only guess that it's my turn right now. I'm very pleased that we started to discuss various elements of the conflict which is happening today with many parties involved and which is involving currently both Russia and the Ukraine.
Recording in progress.
Upon my understanding, it's very important to deal with various elements of issues as far as I'm entitled by the Human Rights Council to speak about the issues of the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. I will try to focus on some of the details, which probably not all of them are focusing on the conflict in the Ukraine, but they refer to many other elements because right now we are not still able to see all elements of the conflict of the Ukraine. However, I see my task besides assessing the specific situation which is happening today because of the conflict in the Ukraine, but to address some elements which are possible or which may have a long-term negative humanitarian consequences because of the sanctions which are imposed today. What we today are facing is, unfortunately, the enormous expansion of the use of unilateral sanctions by various states. And unfortunately, today, the forms, types of these sanctions are changing as well. We all remember that at a certain period, and especially at the beginning of 2000, the UN Security Council, due to the very high negative humanitarian impact of sanctions is imposed, legality of which has not been disputed by anyone, changed to more targeted types of measures in order to avoid enormous humanitarian consequences. What we are facing today is that unilateral states referring to the inability or ineffectiveness of the UN Security Council started to impose sanctions unilaterally. And unfortunately, what we are observing that these sanctions become more and more comprehensive, even if they are called targeted. So the term targeted is just misleading in such situation. What we usually observe is that unilateral sanctions target higher state officials, target specific companies, target specific individuals, and quite often cover all sectors of economy, including the financial sectors, preventing any possibility for transaction. And at the very end, the consequences of these sanctions turn to be very comprehensive. Looking at the situation in the what is happening today in the Ukraine, it's necessary to recognize that after 6 waves of unilateral sanctions, and the 7th one is discussed today by the European Union and by the United States as well, enormous scope of unilateral sanctions has been imposed over Russian Federation and over Belarus with references to the conflict to the Ukraine. But beside that, we also need to take into account that companies and individuals as well as third states do not feel free from the situation coming from the unilateral sanctions, because states which impose sanctions as well as the European Union request third states to comply with these sanctions. And if we check the news, we clearly observe the threats to the states as well as threats to the companies to face negative consequences if these companies do not comply with sanctions imposed by the United States or imposed by the European Union. At the European Union, we can see the discussion with Serbia, for example, or Hungary, which doesn't impose fully the set of sanctions of the European Union, or Serbia, which rejects to impose the set of sanctions imposed by the European Union. And at the very end, companies and businesses become scared about possible negative consequences. We have also observed a very high level reputational risk campaign when, for example, companies like Yara, which is proceeding fertilizers from Russia and Belarus into composite fertilizers, faced a very negative approach online, which enhanced the reputational risks of this company. And as a result, when we are discussing the situation, we need to deal with several issues. First of all, we need to speak about the humanitarian impact of sanctions imposed on the situation. Secondly, we need to speak about the consequences of threats and reputational risks for companies and states. And third, we need to speak about overcompliance when the direct threats do not exist. But at the same time, companies and individuals are precautious towards possible consequences they may face both economically and from the point of reputation. Another problem what we are facing today that is different from sanctions of the UN Security Council, unilateral sanctions which are imposed today by states or regional organizations are not very far from being good as concerns the point of legality. It's necessary to take into account that today only sanctions which seek to implement resolutions of the UN Security Council in full conformity with the resolutions are legal under international law. Some other means of pressure which can be qualified as retortions or which can be qualified as countermeasures in full conformity with the law of international responsibility are also legal from the point of international law. Unfortunately, what we are facing today, the enormous amount of measures which are currently applied by states or regional organizations do not fall within either of these categories. Measures taken by the UN Security Council.
From this point in the recording, we had technical issues, so we had to retroactively dub the audio. Our sincerest apologies.
Issues of responsibility or redress exist today. That's why the application of these measures continues. As a result, when one speaks about the treatment of the issue of unilateral measures, it's necessary to assess their legality in every specific case.
It is important as well to consider the effect of unilateral sanctions. It is the most vulnerable part of the population that suffers the most consequences of sanctions. Once the sanctions are in place, another aspect that the population experiences is a reduction in their access to financial resources. Many people and businesses lose their source of income if they have been producing goods or services with loans they lose the ability to do normal transactions, such as booking flight tickets on international airlines or booking hotels in order to travel. But if we look at the most vulnerable, theirs is the situation that becomes the most serious. People that are, for example, receiving state subsidies, like mothers with infants, depend on the government, and we see that it reduces the government's ability to care for these people when sanctions are imposed. Another type of person that we are coming across who is especially affected by sanctions are people with special needs. Again, for example, people who are in constant need of medical treatments and specialized medicines. It's also important to note that even in countries with a relatively developed medical and pharmaceutical industry, they can become affected by restrictions on imports or exports of necessary materials. So imagine how bad it can get for a country not to be able to import either the medicine or the raw materials to be able to produce them. For example, in Russia now, the people who have certain types of cancer or who may be allergic to the traditional drugs now are having trouble accessing more specialized imported oncological medicines. Furthermore, in the case of food security, we are seeing grain stored in warehouses now that is not able to move to the international market to be bought or sold because of the sanctions. This furthermore becomes a problem in terms of feeding their populations for importing countries in the global south because of these war intentions that add supply chain disruptions. Even though food products and medicines are normally excluded from sanctions, technically, these supposed limitations in sanction policy are usually ineffective at allowing these products to be traded as needed. The same situation happens with the transport and logistic companies, because even when they transport goods like fertilizers, food products, or medicines, they still find themselves pressured in other ways and are often not able to deliver their goods. And when we look at the topic of financial transactions, many international banks don't allow transactions from people or companies with bank accounts in sanctioned countries. I'll refer to reports from numerous international human rights and food security organizations like the World Food Program that have reported the difficulty that sanction causes on allowing the delivery of food. And we're not just talking about the transport of food that is already harvested, but also food to be grown in the future. The countries that depend on imported fertilizers are now finding higher prices because of the longer supply lines due to the sanctions. They are now sometimes simply not available in countries in Africa and Latin America. I asked agricultural experts if it was possible to substitute the fertilizers that are not available with different fertilizers, and they said that no, it's not completely possible to replace the necessary inputs to create the fertilizers that these countries need for their agriculture to feed their populations. Together with various of my colleagues, we have made many press statements affirming that sanctions should never interfere with critical infrastructure like what is happening today. Other elements of critical infrastructure like electrical maintenance, gas, mining, agricultural machinery, and food processing are also affected by unilateral sanctions. A while ago, a report came out detailing the lack of critical inputs for agricultural machinery in Venezuela because of sanctions. And we've seen the lack of imported machinery harm the Venezuelan agriculture sector. Therefore, the lives of the people in the sanctioned countries are often gravely threatened. Sanctions also affect civil aviation, preventing the movement of goods and people. That's why I've been advocating the exclusion of this broader understanding of critical infrastructure from sanctions. But unfortunately, so far, we've been receiving a lot of resistance from the official channels within government and the international community. Now, I'll note another element. I'll call this element cooperation. We must recognize that the unilateral sanctions do affect the multilateral relations of all parties involved. Unilateral sanctions reduce the ability to resolve conflicts in a multilateral way. Another problem is the transferring of money through banks in sanctioned countries. So governments aren't able to pay their diplomatic staff. They are also not able to maintain the security for example, invited dignitaries to the country. Also affected are academic contacts, as it is often impossible for scholars to go from a sanctioned country to participate in international conferences, to join international associations, to participate in or access internet scholarly databases. One major example during the pandemic that has majorly limited citizens of various countries to participate in the outside world has been, for example, with Zoom. The people in areas of Donetsk and Lugansk cannot use Zoom since the war began, along with the people in other countries such as Iran or North Korea and other sanctioned countries as well. There is also the tendency to limit the ability of intellectuals and academics from sanctioned countries to publish in international journals and academic newspapers. The position of my mandate is that we must resolve all of these conflicts between states through peaceful means and according to international law. Unilateral sanctions massively affect the search for peace, the search for peaceful resolutions, and excludes the sanctioned country from the political, social, cultural, medical, and academic life of the world. According to the UNESCO, it is the right of every human to participate in a cultural life and have access to scientific advancements. Unfortunately, what I see is that unilateral sanctions don't work to solve conflicts. In reality, unfortunately, they tend to inflame the situation and affect the human rights of all the people in the sanctioned country and even people outside of the country that are affected. In conclusion, the use of unilateral sanctions in order to punish or force desired policies onto certain countries, usually by powerful nations like the United States, is an abuse of international law and breaks up the ability of the international community to work multilaterally for peace in our world. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are grateful for the intervention of the rapporteur, who gives us an objective view of how unilateral coercive measures have had an impact on this conflict. And once again, we are calling for a reflection by the actors in this scenario. Let us move on now to our next panelist. We would like to introduce former UN independent expert, Professor AIDHDES. He is unfortunately not able to make it today, but he has left us a video of his comments, which we will now listen to with great anticipation. So without any further ado, let's listen to Professor AIDHDES' video.
Good afternoon. I'm AIDHDES, the former independent expert on international order. And as you know, I served the Human Rights Council from 2012 to 2018, and I presented 14 reports to the Council and to the General Assembly. Now, the issue of the Ukraine war, no doubt a great tragedy, and our priority has to be peacemaking, a quid pro quo, a compromise that recognizes the interests of the Ukrainians, of the Ukrainian people, of the Russians, and establishes a security architecture for all of Europe. What is necessary, of course, is a global security architecture, which in principle the United Nations Charter was supposed to create. Now, we do have in the United Nations Charter a rules-based international order. Problem is that most states do not implement this rules-based international order. The Charter being akin to a constitution, it should commit all states to those purposes and principles, to wit, peace, human rights and development. But of course, geopolitical considerations and economic considerations have always taken precedence over human rights. Coming back to Article 2 paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, is evident that the invasion on 24 February 2022 entailed a breach of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. This article prohibits the use of force without approval of the Security Council, the use of force without a clear prior military attack that would trigger Article 51, which is the article on self-defense. Now, the idea of preemptive self-defense or preventive self-defense is not recognized in international law. It was not recognized in the case of Iraq, and it's certainly not recognized in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As the case may be, there is a prehistory to this. The mainstream media focuses on the 24th of February 2022. I focus on the 24th, or rather 22nd of February 2014. That is when the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych was toppled by an unconstitutional coup d'etat, and a regime was established in Kiev, which, instead of reaching its hand to reconcile and unite all Ukrainians, took a Russophobic policy, started with legislation prohibiting the use of the Russian language, to a point that the Russian-speaking population, which is 1/3 of the population of Ukraine, felt threatened. Now, what happened in February and March of 2014 is indispensable to understand what is happening today. To wit, the Russians in the Crimea exercised the right of self-determination. They held a referendum. They had a unilateral declaration of independence by the parliament. Only then did they request being reincorporated into Russia. As everybody knows, Ukraine had no links to Crimea prior to the transfer by Nikita Khrushchev of Crimea from Russia to the Ukraine without consultation of the population. As the case may be, the Crimeans no doubt voted for reunification with Russia. The Duma, the parliament in Russia, approved it. It went on to the Constitutional Court in Russia, which also approved it. Only then was it signed by Putin. So it is, in terms of international law, incorrect to speak of an annexation of Crimea. Here we have a classic case of exercise of the right of self-determination, and in a peaceful manner. Unfortunately, it was not peaceful in Lugansk and in Donetsk, in the Donbass. There you had a war that led to the first accord, first ceasefire, and the first Minsk agreement, whereby the idea was not to declare Donbass independent from Ukraine. It was simply an idea: sit down, talk about a federal state, talk about a new constitution that will guarantee the autonomy of the Russian-speaking population that evidently feels uncomfortable with the illegitimate regime in Kiev. Now, Ukraine, unfortunately, had 8 years to implement the Minsk agreements. Article 2, paragraph 3 of the United Nations Charter provides that all states are supposed to settle their disputes peacefully through negotiation. It says here all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means, in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. Now, this is what happened and what Russia endeavored to do through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, through the Normandy format, through any number of appeals. But as we know from the reports of OSCE, Ukraine is responsible for the vast majority of violations of the Minsk agreements, which, by the way, increased exponentially in January and February of 2022. So here we have a prehistory that must be taken into account in understanding what happened. But there's another prehistory, the very borders of Russia. It is evident, as we know from George Foster Kennan, who wrote an important article in 1997 in the New York Times saying it is a grave mistake for NATO to expand eastwards. It is a needless provocation against Russia. You must consider that the world that Mikhail Gorbachev dreamt of in 1989 was the integration of Russia into the West. No more Cold War, no more hostility, no more Russophobia. And they bent over backwards to, shall we say, become partners with Germany and France and the countries of the European Union. Unfortunately, the promises given by James Baker, the American Secretary of State, by any number of other American officials, which are demonstrable in the minutes of all of these meetings in 1989, 90, and 91, it was quite clear that NATO was not supposed to move 1 inch toward the east. Now that, shall we say, oral agreement was unilaterally broken by the West. And now that has consequences. It's not only George Kennan that tells us that. The last American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, has written extensively on it. Professor John Mersheimer of the University of Chicago, his last book, The Great Delusion, explains very clearly that this kind of provocation entails a menace. And allow me to go back to Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. We're talking about the prohibition not only of the use of force by Russia, also the prohibition of the threat of the use of force. And there's no question that arming Ukraine to the teeth, training its army, against whom? Obviously, only against Russia. The elected government of Yanukovych. That in itself was an aggression essentially financed by the West, by the National Endowment for Democracy, by NGOs that subverted the internal order of Ukraine, subverted the stability of Ukraine. Now, the war, the hot war, was confined only to the Donbass. There were constant shelling of civilian populations in Donetsk and in Lugansk. Now, that violated, obviously, any number of agreements, also the UN Charter, and the responsibility is not only on the part of the Ukraine, it's also on the part of those countries that have delivered the arms to make it possible. So here you have a very complex situation in which, if and when there's any criminal proceeding concerning the crime of aggression, all of this will have to be taken into account. But let's look at NATO. Why does NATO even exist? In 1991, the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. And that would have been the moment to say, what is the raison d'etre of NATO? None, because NATO is not supposed to usurp the functions of the Security Council. NATO is not the military force of the United Nations, and is not supposed to take unilateral action as it did illegally in Yugoslavia. Bearing in mind that the Warsaw Pact was disbanded in 1991, one cannot escape the question, why wasn't NATO disbanded? What was NATO's function after 1991? Where was the enemy? Russia wanted integration in the West. Russia wanted cooperation with the West. Russia wanted disarmament. So what's the problem? Now, NATO, like many organizations, in order to exist, NATO actually necessarily must create an enemy. And that's the only role, the only function of Russia. That was assigned by NATO to Russia. And that means constant menacing, constant provocation, so that should bite. And I would say the bear didn't want to bite anybody anymore. The bear wanted trade. The bear wanted this economic situation for the Russian people. And it was not seeking any expansion to the east, whereas NATO broke and started expanding into countries that were former members of the Warsaw Pact. But going back to the principles of international law in the UN Charter, as I said, the most important principle is the prohibition of the use of force. And the threat of the use of force, which leads to the use of force, to being threatened and then reacting to a threat. Now, here is the responsibility of NATO, and that reminds me of the Nuremberg in the London Agreement of 8 August 1945, had the crime against peace, which today in the Statute of Rome of the International Criminal Court is the crime of aggression. It's basically the same thing. So the Nazis were of Article 6A of the crime against peace. But there was also another article that it seems to be forgotten. That is Article 9 of the Nuremberg Statute. And that is the article that creates the category of criminal organizations. Now, which are criminal organizations? Well, an organization that commits grave violations of international law in total impunity. Now, if you look at the crimes committed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and in Syria, does that not qualify NATO as a criminal organization? And when Finland and Sweden seek membership in NATO, don't they realize that they're actually seeking a criminal organization, an organization that acts outside of the United Nations, an organization that engages in aggression, commits war crimes and crimes against humanity, and nobody gets prosecuted. Nobody gets brought before the International Criminal Court. Now, let's get back to the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Without a doubt, there have been serious war crimes committed, but there's no monopoly of war crimes on the part of the Russian forces. I have no doubt that there have been rapes. I have no doubt that there have been war and killings of civilians. All of that has to be investigated. So an international investigation is legitimate. But any such investigation, if it's going to have any credibility at all, has to investigate the crimes committed by Ukrainian forces and by mercenaries in the Donbass and elsewhere. I mean, there is evidence that Russian prisoners of war have been assassinated. There's evidence that Russian prisoners of war have been tortured. All of that has to be investigated. But I don't look at international criminal justice as a solution to the problem of the Ukraine war. The problem in the Ukraine war is lack of good faith. The problem in the Ukraine war is that quite evidently NATO are waging a proxy war against Russia till the last Ukrainian. They're using the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder. That is really unethical, unconscionable by the Human Rights Council. It should be condemned by the mainstream media. But the narrative that you get in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, unfortunately also in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, in Le Monde, in El País, etc., is a skewed narrative. It's a one-sided narrative. And that must end if we want to reach a peaceful solution. People should understand that there's no military victory here possible. That has been so, shall we say, slow in achieving its goals in Ukraine, precisely because they agree to the evacuation of civilians. They agree to evacuation corridors, concentrate on the military targets. Unfortunately, there's always civilian victims of any military attack, but that is not the thrust of this war, of this Russian operation. What the Russians wanted was security. They put it on the table since 2007, Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which he laid down the needs of Russia and also the red lines that should not be crossed. 1 year later, 2008, under the presidency of George W. Bush, there you had NATO already offering membership. Georgia, a very, very big mistake, and now we realize it. Now we know that baiting the bear and provoking the bear eventually would lead to war, as had been predicted by many, not only by Professor John Mearsheimer. So, getting back to the issue, how to make peace, here we need mediators. Turkey mediated. There was an agreement. Ukraine would withdraw, and the agreement was ready to be signed, and evidently the United States pressured Zelensky into not signing it. Now that is not unlike what happened in 2017. You may remember in Venezuela, the Maduro government and the opposition, 2 years hosted by Jose Luis Rodriguez Zapatero, the former Prime Minister of Spain, and I incorporated the compromise that had been reached in my report to the Human Rights Council of 2018. The report is reproduced here in my book, Building a Just World Order. Now, that's chapter 12, the whole complex of Venezuela sanctions, etc. What happened in 2000 had been reached. The agreement was ready for signature. Julio Borges gets a phone call. He's told, no firme, don't sign, and he doesn't sign. So 2 years of fruitful negotiation down the drain because the United States don't have to deal with Maduro. We will put you in the driver's seat. So what has the United States offered Zelensky? Obviously the Europeans have offered membership in the European Union, but that's not going to be easy. Even if they have candidate status, that is not going to be easy. So what is important now is reality, that we have a reality check, that Zelensky understands that he's not going to win militarily, that every day that goes on, Ukrainians are dying, and of course Russia. So let's stop the killing, and let's sit down and reach an agreement that will be acceptable to all sides. There will be no winners, and let's turn the page. Let's start to principles of the United Nations Charter. Let's try to abide to the United Nations Charter, and let's have Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, mediate in this crisis, which would be to the benefit of all of humanity, not only to the benefit of the Ukrainians and Russians.
That was Alfred Desaias. We thank the former UN expert for his intervention, and he gave us a very clear perspective on the legal aspects of NATO's intervention in the region. It is important to understand that the law can not be broken, but sadly, in times of war, laws seem to be silent. We call for this perspective to change for the sake of humanity. We move on to our next panelist. He is a former member of European Parliament and has studied closely one of the situations we are interested in at this event, Russophobia. He will give us a historical context of the situation so that from his perspective, he can shed light on the reasons for this conflict. Without further ado, let's hear from the former MEP, Javier Couso. Good afternoon in Spain. Hello, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank AIDHDES for inviting me to participate in this panel with such important participants, especially in a context in which such conversations are necessary in the face of the practical unanimity of the Western media, including the country where I speak, which is Spain. We have seen the curtailing of our right to information, to receive diverse sources against Article 20 of the Constitution with the prohibition, for example, of Russian channels, Russia Today, but also with a complete absence of journalism. When all the big channels, it's impossible to hear different understanding of what is going on right now in the Ukraine. I want to continue on the line on which Mr. Desaias was speaking, that is, to delve into the consequences of what is happening. It is necessary to contextualize its background, and that contextualization is necessary to understand. And that's what the great emporiums of communication ignore. We have to draw conclusions so that conflicts don't repeat themselves. And though that in the 21st century, with multilateral treaties and multilateral institutions, we thought we would be looking forward to a more peaceful stage for humanity, that has unfortunately not happened like that. Therefore, we have to go back to the geopolitical history to understand what is happening with the crisis in Ukraine right now. And we have to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and go back, like Professor Desaias reminded us, to the breaking of the agreements between the Soviet Union and the USA, above all during the time of the reunification of Germany, in which we have already shown that there were talks, and it was promised that there would be no expansion of NATO to the east. Evidently, in the times in which Yeltsin governed Russia, it became a subaltern Russia, very close to neoliberalism, and it delivered until it didn't deliver anymore. There was a breaking, I repeat again, at all levels, military, political, diplomatic, and the destabilization and reconfiguration of the post-Soviet space by the power that had won that battle of the Cold War and had become a unipolar global power. I'm talking about the attack of NATO against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and later Serbia, in an attack that was outside the limits of the UN Charter and also breaking all the agreements that had taken place in both Helsinki and the Paris Charter. That is the first to break the peace and violate the borders in Europe. In Europe is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. After a series of destabilization of the post-Soviet space through the color revolutions that we can characterize as illegal power change operations that have happened and that we see have historically been propagated by Western European and American secret services. We should also recognize the NATO expansion previously alluded to. We must remember in 1999, there was Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary that joined NATO. In 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovenia. And in 2008, Albania. I think it's clear that there is an offensive siege against the borders of the Russian Federation, and above all, NATO reinvents itself as the pillar of Europe. If we read the documents we have access to already of the US Secret Services and the people who designed the geostrategic objectives of the United States, the leaders of NATO wanted to maintain and has maintained European security under US geopolitical control. That is to say, there is a clear intention to subject Europe through NATO and prevent, above all, a security structure that includes Russia. The objective is clear: break the cooperation between the EU and Russia, because it could give way to an independent pole of cooperation against the interests of the US. We have already seen the results: the preliminary active military siege against Russia and causing conflicts, as we have seen in Georgia, before in Chechnya, but also attacking and isolating countries that have historically had commercial and security relations with Russia, like Syria. We also see an attempt to short-circuit the oil and gas purchases of the EU. We see that the European Union has a strategic weakness in energy storage, but has had a faithful partner in Russia, which has supplied it with its security of fulfilling contracts for a cheap gas necessary to inject into all parts of the industrial structure. After the crisis in the Ukraine, we are seeing how it is being replaced by liquefied natural gas extracted by fracking from the USA and other sources that clearly make buying energy more expensive, with the decrease in buying power felt in the pockets of European citizens, despite the fact that they still depend on Russian oil. We should remember that at the beginning of this conflict, it was about to open Nord Stream 2 pipeline that would supply gas directly from Russia to Germany, which is the industrial and economic motor of the European Union, and therefore, well, one of the clear intentions of the US, which we see even with the threat of sanctions that the special rapporteur mentioned before, and against the gas line. And after their threats, they accomplished in shutting it down. Ukraine has been used as a destabilizing element in the same way that destabilization has worked in other countries that we've seen. We saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Syria, we've seen it in other places, and that the strategy was to increase the ethnic and cultural conflicts. And if we study it, we see a long hand behind the scenes exacerbating and causing these disagreements to occur between populations that live together for a long time without any issues. Ukraine is a diverse country with important ethnic and cultural minorities. We have Russian descendants, Romanian and Hungarian descendants, Tatars, and a very significant presence of people with Russian culture in the east, in the south, with a clear difference from those in the West. This clearly crystallizes first in the Color Revolution in 2004, but later by what was called the Euromaidan Revolution, which was nothing more than a coup d'etat against the Ukrainian constitution. It was unconstitutional because in the impeachment process that was called for never happened. Ukraine's constitution clearly stated that there had to be a two-thirds parliamentary support, establish an investigation commission, then organize a vote that must be won by two-thirds, and later a rectification process by the Supreme Court. This was not the case because it happened in just one day. Obviously, one day was not enough to carry out this constitutional process. In this coup d'etat, shock troops from the extreme right wing were used, and openly neo-Nazi snipers were used, as we saw again in another coup attempt in 2002 against the government of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And it is known that the snipers were in a building controlled by militants from one of those neo-Nazi militias. The Pravi sector and the right sector, something that even the representative of foreign policy, the late Senator McCain, knew, as well as someone who is truly Russophobic in Victoria Nuland, who in those times was the Secretary of State for Europe and European Affairs. And known for her statements that have been recorded for posterity when her conversation with the ambassador in Kiev was overheard, which clearly designed the type of government that would come out of the coup. Furthermore, when the U.S. ambassador asked about what she thought about the European Union, it's recorded in the annals of history that Nuland said, "F the EU," forgive my language. The final result has been a country divided socially, politically, and culturally. After the coup, there was a portion of the population that felt persecuted, and protests broke out in the south and east of Ukraine that were violently put down. There has still not been any investigation into the attack on the seat of the unions in Odessa, and then a march against the coup that was impulsed by the Euromaidan, in which over 40 people were burned to death and over 100 still remain disappeared. And there are photos that the mainstream media prefers not to discuss of how the people fled the fires and fell from the building only to be made sure dead by clubbing with iron bars, stabbing with knives, and even shots to the head by militants in these neo-Nazi gangs. These measures taken by the coup government are clearly reproachable since 2014. The first was the suspension of the principled law on state language policy. Before, Ukrainian and Russian were co-official languages. In 2018, the Upper Constitutional Court certified the preeminence of Ukrainian alone. Finally, we're seeing how there's an attempt at linguistic cleansing. And then an educational law was passed which would have direct consequences on Russian speakers by prohibiting the teaching of Russian, which then gave place to a persecution of the Russophone cultural minorities. Furthermore, it clearly distinguishes between languages of indigenous people, that is to say, the cultures within the Ukrainian norms, with the Tatar people, for example, from the external people, that is to say, the Russians. There is a clear attempt to attack the cultural and linguistic diversity that exists in Ukraine. We saw the implementation of revisionist histories of the Nazi genocide in the decommunization laws, in order to erase the historic role of the Soviet Union in the Second World War against the Nazi menace and imposing and the edification of a Ukraine that excludes cultural and linguistic diversity. These policies whitewash the Nazi past of the genocide of World War II by rehabilitating figures such as Stepan Bandera or Roman Shukili. That is, they transform them into fighters for democracy and independence. These same people who were collaborationists in the Nazi genocide. It's important to understand this to realize the project of rightward drift and whitewashing of these horrible acts that we thought humanity had already condemned. The National Institution of Ukrainian Memory is responsible for eliminating the history of anti-Semitism, pogroms, and ethnic cleansing that these Nazi collaborators undertook. Additionally, they whitewash organizations like A1 or UPA responsible for war crimes and mass executions of Jews, Poles, and Russians. We must also recognize the incorporation in the military and police structure of neo-Nazi elements. As was discussed by Reuters in 2018, although it isn't discussed in the big media now, that counted 100,000 members of Nazi groups in the military and the armed forces of the Ukrainian state. There's also the prohibitions, the banning of the Ukrainian Communist Party, which represented 14% of the Ukrainian vote, and which was also accompanied by harassment and restrictions on the press in the Russian language, and physically attacking journalists. Poroshenko, the incoming president, imposed a parliamentary order for an anti-terrorist operation against the culturally Russian areas that were against the coup, covered up with the euphemism of counterterrorism to hide what was really a full-scale and irregular war against its own population. The Poroshenko government further degrades in Donetsk and Luhansk all of its responsibilities as a state. The right to liberty and security, the right to a just judgment, the right to a speedy trial, the right to and respect of the family and private life, and the freedom of movement. The Special UN Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Executions, including summary and arbitrary executions, collects testimonies of victims about secret detention, tortures, and disappearances on the part of the security forces and intelligence services of the Ukrainian state. The Spanish Organization for the Help of Migrants informed about the human rights situation in Ukraine, including extrajudicial executions, war crimes against the civilian population, indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations, etc. The balance of the supposed anti-terrorism operation since 2014 has been, according to the UN, 14,000 dead, 30,000 wounded, and 1.5 million displaced. Facts that don't interest the conformity of Western press and public opinion, but are true. These problems were attempted to be solved through the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, which we must remember were signed after several defeats by the Ukraine in the already declared People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass. I followed it from my position as Vice President of the Commission on External Affairs and the Subcommittee of Security and Defense. I saw these agreements that we thought would give us a possibility for a structure of security and stability for a conflict that we saw as it was increasing in the number of deaths and grave implications for security of all of Europe. It was the first Minsk Protocol in September 2014, and then the Memorandum of Minsk from September 19th, 2014. That consisted of 12 points, including a ceasefire, legal decentralization for a self-government of the Donbass provinces, and which was signed between the Organization for European Security Cooperation, the Russian ambassador in Kiev, the Ukraine, and the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. That is to say, we had all the elements to be able to work together for a peace to a conflict that went even further than the terrible repression by the Ukraine against those provinces that didn't feel like they were being represented in the new government after the coup. We arrive at Minsk II on February 12th, 2015. The same signers, and they were 13 points that clearly highlight the possibility of solving this problem. Obviously, a ceasefire to end the suffering of the civilian population, the retiring of heavy artillery and multiple rocket launchers, lines of demarcation, verification and monitoring the ceasefire, local elections, a general amnesty for fighters, and an important constitutional reform process of decentralization that would guarantee rights of that population that was being repressed and didn't feel like it had the ability to integrate in the process after the Euromaidan. Later, it was agreed to a devolution to further control of borders until these 13 points were followed. On June 6, 2015, the Normandy process was started as a follow-up with Germany, France, and Russia, and Ukraine. But obviously, we didn't see any interest on the part of the West to maintain or reach an agreement in these accords and require Ukraine to maintain those accords that they had agreed to. The ultra-nationalist sector and their Nazi battalions never held up their part of the ceasefire, and we have images of those neo-Nazi battalions threatening Zelensky if he upheld the Minsk Accords. We now know, due to the declarations by Poroshenko that are available for all to see, that the Minsk agreements were an excuse to rearm and reorganize the Ukrainian armed forces. That is to say, to gain time to defeat those provinces in a military fashion. Later, we have come to know by declarations from militaries participating in NATO that the Western military services dedicated themselves to preparing 10,000 trained troops per year and a reorganization and rearmament of the Ukrainian armed forces in a way that led to the Ukrainian army that has converted into the second largest army in Europe. Zelensky, who followed Poroshenko, didn't change course despite electoral promises to achieve peace and agreement in the Donbass provinces and with Russia through the Minsk Accords. Instead, they continued systematically bombing the Donbass and continued the exclusive legislation regarding minorities. Popularly known as the Total Ukrainianization Law, which is interesting and I will read directly from the text, defines minorities as an indigenous ethnic community that has formed on Ukrainian territory with a distinct culture and doesn't distinct culture, a traditional, social, or representative organisms represents a minority ethnic group and doesn't have its own state formation outside of Ukraine. That is, it completely excludes the Russian ethnic group from being considered and protected as a minority. So when we hear the great uproar about the ethnic cleansing that was claimed to have been done in Serbia, it is interesting that those same Western eyes don't see the legislative attempts to do ethnic cleansing with these laws being passed in Ukraine. After the beginning of the military operation by Russia in February, the Ukraine has since banned 12 political parties and has additionally banned media and has permitted street pogroms of dissidents and Roma people. There are even images circulated of people being tortured. And not just by those neo-Nazi and Nazi squadrons, but by the very same members of the state security forces as well. Furthermore, we have not had any investigations of the war crimes that we've been able to see thanks to social media, or of mistreatment or extrajudicial executions of Russian prisoners of war, the use of the armed forces of Ukraine of human shields in, for example, Mariupol and other cities in Donbass, or indiscriminate bombings against civilian areas in Donetsk and Luhansk. The conclusion of what has happened since the coup d'etat in Ukraine and the escalation of the military conflict that began in 2014 with the intent to exclude and bombard an important part of the Ukrainian population, with the attempt to exclude a great number of ethnic and cultural groups that compose Ukraine, the adoption of an ultranationalist politics that whitewashes the collaboration of Ukrainian nationalists with Nazis in World War II, the toleration and integration of openly Nazi organizations in the armed forces and the security forces of the state, the xenophobia, Russophobia, and ethnic and linguistic cleansing, the systematic action against civil and political liberties, and the practices of total war and collective punishment against the people of Donbass and the South, above all in areas with a Russian cultural population. Therefore, I will go ahead and stop here. The purpose of my presentation was I wanted to give a series of characterizations with clear proofs of what is obviously the attempts of a coup government backed up by the West in order to close the stranglehold on Russia, impede a common security structure with Europe, and committing terrible crimes against human rights. The United Nations take into account and realize that it can't allow the geopolitics of the US to count more than international humanitarian law, and making that law discretionary according to a few actors. We must go back to the negotiating table, but remembering that NATO should stop expanding offensively against one of the neighbors of the European Union, and we should try to build structures of security that would protect us both, and make a call to end these policies that are clearly similar to the policies of dictatorships of the Southern Cone, or even more fascist given its use of ethnic and political persecution. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to my intervention in this event before the United Nations Human Rights Council. Thank you for giving us this important understanding and for surely giving us a historical context that many of us don't know. If we know history, if we live it and are aware of it, we understand without a doubt its origins. It is, as they say, the thirst of the people to know their history. Let's move on to our next panelist, Hernando Calvo Ospina, a Colombian journalist contributor to Monde Diplomatique in Paris, political scientist and historian. He will give us now a perspective on the role of the media today in this conflict. It is undoubtedly the most important of the weapons in a war. And therefore, without any further ado, we would like to now welcome on to the panel Hernando Calvo Espina from Bogotá, Colombia. Hernando Calvo Espina, good afternoon to you in Paris.
Muchas gracias a ustedes. Muchas gracias por esta invitación.
Hello. Thank you for having me on. Let me start by saying that for a few decades now, the corporate information, in quotes, media have become the frontline generals at war. They are the generals at the head of the bomber squads, those who drop bombs and bombs and bombs into the brains of those who read, see, and hear them in order to, according to the military jargon, soften the ground. In other words, so that the real military can invade and kill with the approval of, quote-unquote, international public opinion, which has already been convinced that these crimes to be committed on civilian populations, so-called collateral effects, are actually necessary to save them. They also say that they are necessary to save democracy. They even go so far as to say it is to save Western Christian civilization. These corporate media hide the fact that they are part of the interests of the big economic transnationals, which are mainly American. This informative magic of these corporate media was born after the humiliation that the USA received with its defeat in Vietnam. The powers that be in Washington ensured that its mainstream media had to be with it, telling what it needed to tell. And so it did. Since then, the mainstream press has rarely, and I repeat, rarely, insistently published anything that would harm the fundamental interests of the homeland. But what is happening now with quote-unquote information has never happened before, and I didn't think that it could ever happen, especially in Europe. We have never seen such information hysteria, and worse, never has it been seen that with a simple declaration of a ruler or a public figure, the media of a supposedly unfriendly country would be censored to prevent, defend, protect the supposed truth and objectivity, as what happened with Russia Today across Europe and North America. Never before have the media censored themselves to such an extreme. not giving information from the enemy camp so as to not give the enemy a chance to tell their side of the story. Now there is only one unimpeachable truth. Ours, that of our camp, of our villages, of our allied countries, that of the USA and its NATO. Although it is known that this source has always lied to us, it lied to us in order to make the international public opinion accept the invasions and bombings in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Yugoslavia, Libya, the list goes on and on. It lied. The big corporate media knew it was lying, but they dropped the disinformation bombs on the human brains to soften them up, like military targets. So many lies committed so many millions of crimes, and to steal the natural resources of so many nations that were defenseless. I remember now what Cuba has gone through since the 60s of the last century. The CIA prepared, with the complicity of the mainstream press, a campaign to damage the image of the revolution. It was said, or rather was insisted, even with cartoons, that Fidel Castro would take children away from the opposition and send them to the Soviet Union, where they would be killed and put in tin cans. And people believed it. You can still find people who believe it. And Cuba continues to endure all kinds of slander that the mainstream corporate press takes care to spread. But we are not far off. The question that remains unanswered by Washington: where are the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? What is certain is that at least 1 million Iraqis have died because of this pretext for invasion. Iraq, a devastated country with its oil resources in the hands of the USA and some of its NATO partners. Afghanistan. NATO invaded it, supposedly to put an end to opium trafficking and women's freedom, mainly. NATO recently came out of there defeated, but while it was invading that nation, the situation of women was worse, and Europe became filled with Afghan opium. Oh, and the terrible Taliban remained in power. Why has the mainstream corporate press never explained this or looked to Washington or Brussels for answers? In 2019, COVID-19 exploded all over the world. The US and its allies said it came from China. There was no proof, but the mainstream media was saying it and repeating it. And it started almost a xenophobia. It was China that was to blame for this terrible problem. And I repeat, the proof? It still doesn't exist. But the Chinese bats and the Chinese people were made as the culprits. The other versions, which clearly point to the USA and NATO, why are they not taken into account? Let's go back to current events. For months, there has been a growing Russophobia supported by the media. Russia is to blame for everything. And as the big corporate press says so it must be true.
a buscar armas de destrucción masiva y hasta el día de hoy.
Because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example,
Pero en Irak costó más de 1 millón y está costando más de 1 millón.
there is no oil in Spain or France. And so great is the military campaign of the corporate disinformation media that it is not realized that these two countries produce oil. It is not the fault of the war in Ukraine. Now all the economic problems in Europe and the United States, according to the big corporate media, are just Russia's fault for invading Ukraine. And of course, nobody cares to explain why Russia had to act like that. That context isn't important to the mainstream media in the West. Our brains have been so marinated without our even having to think of it, that not even a large part of the left or the great progressive intellectuals are talking about calling for dialogue to stop the war in Ukraine. No, it's only accepted with a docility comparable to that of a sheep to the slaughter, that war is indeed necessary. We must be clear that this would be a war in which Europe loses, where Europe shoots itself in the foot at the request of the United States, and for nothing.
Pero se decía y se creyó porque el bombardeo fue tan tremendo, los grandes medios de información, que Fidel Castro cogía a los hijos de los opositores.
As in the case of the other genocidal wars, where the U.S. military apparatus ends up as the big winner and then decides to throw a few crumbs to its allies. The U.S. is offering some small rewards to Europeans in order to stay loyal to its embargoes against Russia that are costing Europe billions of dollars in losses, in higher oil revenues, and lack of basic supplies. Someday, hopefully, not too far away, this current massive psychological warfare against Russia will be studied in some universities and discovered for what it is. And that war that is being waged against a nation that is, once again, at war with Nazism, against a nation that has never created international terrorist groups, as those NATO nations have done, and especially its highest expression, its highest realization, and its founder, the United States of America. Thus, the mainstream corporate press, by the impeccable alliance with NATO, does little to give hope for the peace of mankind. Thank you, Carlos. To finish and give the floor to questions or any other types of interventions, I will now give the floor to Professor Ren Xiaoting, professor at the Lanzhou University of Technology, who will give us a comprehensive perspective of what is happening in the Donbass through his background and experience. Professor, a very good evening in Beijing. How are you doing today? We're ready to hear your intervention at the panel today. Hello, Professor Ren Xiaoting. Hello. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. I will start my intervention today by saying that 8 years have passed since anti-government armed conflicts broke out in 2014 in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine. Back in 2019, the war had already killed more than 10,000 people. According to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, more than 3,000 civilians were killed during the armed conflict in the Donbass region. Combat operations on the ground have not stopped for 8 years. At least 5,500 civilians were wounded and more than 2,200 civilian infrastructures were destroyed or partially destroyed during this period. The French war correspondent and documentary filmmaker Bonnel's 2015 documentary Donbass is a true account of the devastated Donbass region under fire. But it wasn't until this war between the Ukraine and Russia broke out that the war in the Donbass really came into international view. It is a very worthy thing for us to think about. Both the armed conflict in 2014 and the current Russo-Ukrainian war have their roots in the long-established strife in Ukraine's history. Despite the signing of the Minsk agreements to resolve the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, the lack of trust and mutual accusations in the implementation of the agreements, even on their own, eventually led to the agreements becoming nothing more than dead letter. But since Ukraine is an important pawn in the fierce competition between Russia, the US-led NATO, and the European Union over the geopolitical map of Europe, neither side will give in easily on this issue. Strictly speaking, the war taking place in the Donbass region did not start recently, not even from 2014, but much earlier. If one looks further back, one will see that any war, whatever it specifically is called, is not caused by some single issue, but rather erupts from a complex interplay of different historical, cultural, traditional, ethnic, and economic interests. Despite the fact that the war took place in the Donbass, no one can doubt now the profound and long-term impact it has had on the world order and on human society. Here, I do not intend to explain or analyze the finer points of this history or older historical cases. On the one hand, it is because these matters are difficult to clarify in a short period of time, or perhaps even impossible to clarify at all. On the other hand, there is an important factor that needs to be taken into account in addition to the above mentioned reasons. The neo-imperialism and the neo-hegemony, both in the war in the Donbass and in the armed conflicts that occur in other regions as well. For the sake of time, I do not intend to explain much about neo-imperialism and neo-hegemony here. I just want to draw your attention to one point: the quest for sole and eternal hegemony in the economic, scientific, and technical, in the military sphere, in the ideological and cultural sphere, and so on, is the most distinctive feature of today's new imperialism. Since the end of World War II, human society has generally maintained a balanced and stable state, although small-scale wars and regional conflicts have never disappeared. But for a long time, we considered peace and development to be the mainstream of the world. But since the war in Donbass, almost everyone can deeply feel that the whole world seems to be moving toward division and confrontation. The voices of cooperation, unity, and common development are weakening, and the forces that provoke confrontation and plan for war are stirring. The Cold War mentality is back and intensifying, and it is concentrated in the United States of America, which has the greatest influence on international military security. Some countries and groups, in order to seek hegemonic status, in order to pursue absolute control and influence, provoke, launch, even create war, gradually becoming a more and more important option in their policy toolkit to increase their interests. If we look at the world we live in today, we can see clearly that the war in the Donbass region, the broader war between Ukraine and Russia, and the competition between the United States and Russia have long been not just a conflict or a war between two countries, but that these conflicts are increasingly evolving into a broader world conflict. As a Chinese citizen, I have personal feelings about this, given that some forces, represented above all by the United States, have been making up lies. They've been lying and behaving without any bottom line in order to achieve their separationist goals in Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the South China Sea in recent years. Whether it is the war in Donbass or the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, if we look at it from the perspective of a hybrid war, it is in fact the prelude or the beginning of the main drama of a possible Third World War, a hybrid war in which the Cold War and the Hot War are run in parallel. It is a huge impact on international military security, international order, and the future development of mankind. This has not only been revealed, but also continues on the same path. The further reduction of strategic mutual trust among major powers has led to instead a strategic competition and is increasingly oriented towards strategic war. The increasing and deepening security dilemma has directly led to the emergence of a large-scale arms race around the world, with renewal of nuclear weapons and continuously lowering of the threshold for their use already established. These have easily become catalysts for the outbreak of a nuclear war, and now preventing the outbreak of nuclear war has become an incredibly difficult task. The war in Donbass and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine have greatly stimulated the ambitions of some in Western society. The US, India-Pacific strategy, and NATO's globalization goals are focused on China at the same time. In short, the international situation is experiencing the most severe moment in its history since the Cold War, and perhaps even since World War II. Our future direction is full of uncertainties, and while it is obviously difficult to be optimistic based on the basic inertia of the existing situation and some major variables that have to be extrapolated. How to ensure, therefore, that before a new, stable, and rational international order is reestablished, the risk of a worldwide outbreak of full-scale conflict and even war is reduced. This is a major issue that the world must seriously face and address. Otherwise, the turbulent years of intertwined cold and hot wars will become an unavoidable reality in the future. Finally, compared to 30 years ago or 50 years ago, ignorance and prejudice, the debate between ultra-conservatism and ultra-liberalism has never posed such a real and great threat to human society as it is doing right now today. The polarization of ideas inevitably leads to the polarization of behavior, which is a great threat to both individuals and the world as a whole. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate on this panel. Good night from China. Thank you. all. Well, that was an interesting and rich perspective that Professor Xiaoting gives us, and that can be articulated along with the presentation of the former member of the European Parliament. Thank you to all for the figures that you have given us today. We would now like to turn to Wilmar with the Bakia Foundation in Colombia for some final words. Hello, Wilmar. Are you there? We don't hear you yet. Sounds like we might be having a small problem in Colombia with the connection. There. I think that it is going through now. Wilmar, welcome. Hello. Good morning, and thank you to all of the participants. As a organization concerned with human rights, we are sending a big greeting from here in Colombia from the Bakia Foundation. Thanks to the presenters for enlightening us on this very important topic of what is going on right now in the Ukraine that affects such a large population. I think it also reflects a little bit of what we here in Latin America experience as well. And what we see is an expansion of fascism in a completely unhinged way. We have the opportunity now in these conditions to extend our solidarity to those who are suffering from this situation, since the military and political attack of fascism on the region. We in Colombia have also been victims of these exact same policies, where expressing yourself differently or voting for some different political position has become a great risk. And we unfortunately have been facing fascism in our country for the past 50 or even 60 years. Therefore, the nuances that we learn from the situation in Ukraine are very important. And perhaps most important are those experiences about the communication war. The means of communication have become the battle horse used to impose fascist policies on our people by lying and portraying fascism as if it were democracy, being disguised by some governments and institutions worldwide that they themselves are writing on the basis of fascism. We can see, unfortunately, that fascism is advancing across the world, maybe in a more disguised and institutional way. I recognize the importance of the informational struggle because it is necessary for the world to know the truth about the situation that is so full of disinformation and how some people are labeled enemies and others not. But unfortunately, that is decided by the position of a handful of European and American governments. Therefore, we're sending all of our solidarity from Colombia, a big hug to the people suffering from this unfortunate situation, to our brothers and sisters there, and our panelists and colleagues here, and to AIDHDES for opening these very interesting and important spaces. We will surely begin to hear from this area more frequently, precisely to resist this misinformation. We will communicate through the alternative media and social media, where we can start to give a counterweight to this unfortunate situation. Greeting and thank you for your participation. Thanks again. Thank you very much for following us in this event. Rapporteur, Professor Zayas, former member of European Parliament, Dr. Calvo, and Professor Xiaoting. Thank you very much for having given us a little bit of your time and for having clarified a little bit more about what is happening in this conflict. Thank you to the diplomatic delegations and the media for being here. Thanks to COSI in Caracas, to the Bakia Foundation in Bogota for their support. And we remind you that tomorrow we will have a side event on unilateral coercive measures, an event organized by the Global Governance Institute and AIDHDES. For more information, you can write to Li Tian at ChineseInitiative.org or contact@aidhdes.org. Once again, we make a concerted call for dialogue and peace. Good afternoon.